It all started with exhaustion, pure, unadulterated exhaustion. My marriage wasn't necessarily crumbling, but I'd felt like I'd been carrying its weight for far too long. Jack, my husband of 8 years, was as devoted to his work as he once had been to me. His late nights at the office, the constant travel, the way his eyes glazed over when I spoke about anything not related to his business deals. It had all built up into a quiet resentment I couldn't ignore. I needed space. I needed air. When I suggested the spa retreat, Jack didn't even hesitate. "You deserve it," he said, flashing me that same smile that had once made my knees weak but now felt as rehearsed as his business pitches. He even booked the trip himself, surprising me with a first-class ticket to an exclusive resort in the heart of Tuscany. The gesture should have meant more, but it didn't. It felt like another item checked off his to-do list. So I boarded the plane, a mixture of guilt and relief swirling in my chest. Guilt for leaving him behind. Relief for finally doing something for myself. The resort was breathtaking. Rolling hills of olive trees and vineyards, the sweet scent of lavender lingering in the air, and an infinity pool that stretched toward the horizon. My suite was luxurious, with its private balcony overlooking the countryside. It felt indulgent, almost sinful, but for once I let myself bask in it. The first 2 days passed in a haze of massages, facials, and long lazy afternoons by the pool. I brought a book but hardly read it, too distracted by the peace that settled over me like a warm blanket. It was on the 3rd day that I met him. Luca. I was at the resort's wine-tasting event, dressed in a flowy sundress I hadn't worn in years, when he approached me. He was tall with sun-kissed skin, dark curls, and eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. His smile was charmingly crooked and his accent, oh that accent, was a melody I couldn't resist. "May I join you?" he asked, holding up a glass of red wine. I hesitated, but only for a moment. Sure. We talked for hours that night. He was magnetic, effortlessly pulling me into his orbit with stories of his travels and childhood in Florence. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years, a deep, genuine laugh that left me breathless. By the time we said goodnight, the air between us was charged with something electric, something dangerous. The next day I tried to keep my distance. I told myself it was nothing, just harmless flirting. But Luca had other plans. He found me by the pool, bringing 2 glasses of Prosecco and that same disarming smile. "You looked like you could use company," he said, sitting beside me without waiting for an answer. I should have walked away. I should have said no. But I didn't. Something about him awakened a part of me I thought was long gone. The part that craved to feel wanted, to feel seen. That night we met again. And again. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were tangled in the sheets of my suite, his hands mapping every inch of my body, his lips murmuring Italian phrases that made my heart race and my skin burn. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, every sense heightened, every nerve ending alight. It was reckless, selfish, and utterly intoxicating. For the rest of the week, Luca and I were inseparable. We explored the countryside together, shared secret kisses in hidden corners of the resort, and stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. I knew it couldn't last, but I let myself fall deeper, ignoring the inevitable crash. On my final night, as we lay together under the moonlight on my balcony, he turned to me, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Do you love your husband?" he asked softly. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't answer immediately, staring out at the twinkling lights in the distance. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "I think I love who he used to be. Who we used to be." Luca nodded, as if he already knew the answer. "You deserve to be loved completely, wholly. Do not settle for anything less." The words lingered in my mind as I packed the next morning, a strange mix of guilt and clarity settling over me. When I returned to our room for one last goodbye, Luca was gone. No note, no message, nothing. It stung more than I cared to admit, but I told myself it was for the best. I arrived home that evening to find Jack waiting for me, an unusual expression on his face. "How was it?" he asked, his tone too casual. "It was enlightening," I replied, wary of his sudden interest. He nodded, studying me intently. "Did you meet anyone?" My heart stopped. "What?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I had a friend at the resort. Luca." He told me everything. The room spun as his words sank in. I opened my mouth to deny it, to explain, but no sound came out. I needed to know, he continued, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite place. I needed to know if you'd choose him. Or me. You set me up? I whispered, a mixture of anger and disbelief flooding my chest. I had to, he said, his voice breaking. I couldn't keep living like this, wondering if you were still mine. Tears streamed down my face as the weight of his words settled over me. My time in Tuscany hadn't just been an escape, it had been a test. And I had failed. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack looked at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own. Neither do I. We stood there, two broken people trying to find their way back to something that might already be lost. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we couldn't say. And in that moment I realized that sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront the pieces of yourself you've tried so hard to ignore. Whether we'd survive this, I didn't know. But for the first time in years I was ready to try. Jack didn't say another word that night. He just turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of our living room, trembling with the weight of everything that had just happened. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand an explanation, but I was too numb. My chest felt hollow, my head spinning as I replayed his words over and over again. He knew. He had known all along. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the empty space beside me where Jack usually slept. The memory of Luca's touch lingered on my skin, clashing violently with the guilt that burned in my chest. It wasn't just guilt though, it was anger too. Anger at Jack for setting me up, for orchestrating the entire thing like I was some pawn in a game he needed to win. Anger at myself for falling so easily, for letting Luca make me forget, even for a moment, that I was still someone's wife. When morning came, Jack was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hands. He didn't look at me as I walked in. The silence between us was deafening. Are we going to talk about this? I asked finally, my voice raw. He didn't look up. What's there to talk about? You made your choice. Don't do that. I snapped, my anger bubbling to the surface. Don't act like this is black and white. You pushed me away for years, Jack. I didn't just wake up one day and decide to stop loving you. His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his hands gripped the mug just a little too tightly. He wanted to fight, but he also wanted to understand. You were never here, I continued, my voice shaking. I tried to talk to you, to tell you how lonely I was, but you were always too busy, too tired, too everything. So yes, I messed up. I let myself get swept up in something I shouldn't have, but don't you dare pretend like you didn't have a part in this. Jack finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and anger. And that justifies sleeping with someone else? No, I said quietly. Nothing justifies it. But it happened, and we need to figure out where we go from here. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Where we go? You think there's a we after this? The words cut deep, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. There could be, if we both want it. Jack stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, placing his empty mug in the sink. I need time, he said simply, walking out of the kitchen. The days that followed were agonizing. Jack barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was clipped and cold. He spent most nights at the office, and when he was home, he slept in the guest room. The space between us felt insurmountable, a chasm filled with unspoken words and unresolved pain. I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the ache in my chest. But every quiet moment brought memories of Luca, of the way he made me feel, and the realization that I might have destroyed the only life I'd ever known. One evening about a week later, Jack came home earlier than usual. He didn't go straight to the guest room or bury himself in his laptop. Instead, he walked into the living room and sat down across from me. His expression was serious, but there was a softness in his eyes I hadn't seen in days. I've been thinking, he began, his voice steady, about everything. I set down the book I hadn't really been reading and looked at him, my heart pounding. And I'm angry, he admitted. I'm hurt. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, but I also know I'm not blameless in this. I pushed you away. I let us drift apart. His honesty took me by surprise. For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a glimpse of the man I had fallen in love with. Vulnerable. Real. "I don't know if we can fix this," he continued, "but I'm willing to try. If you are." The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the enormity of what lay ahead. "I am," I said softly. "I want to try." And so we began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. We went to couples therapy, where we unpacked years of resentment and miscommunication. I told Jack how lonely I had felt, how invisible. He told me how overwhelmed he had been, how he had thrown himself into work because he didn't know how to face the cracks in our marriage. It wasn't easy. Some days were good, filled with small moments of connection that reminded me of what we once had. Other days were awful, filled with arguments and tears, and the weight of everything we'd been through. There were times I wondered if we were fooling ourselves, if we were trying to salvage something that was already too broken. But then there were moments, like when Jack reached for my hand during a particularly tough therapy session, or when he surprised me with a weekend getaway to the mountains, that gave me hope. Moments that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. As for Luca, he became a ghost of a memory, a reminder of a time when I had lost my way. I didn't contact him and he didn't contact me. I wondered if Jack had told him what happened after I came home, if Luca ever thought about me. But in the end it didn't matter. What mattered was the life I was trying to rebuild with Jack. Months passed and slowly the wounds began to heal. Trust was harder to rebuild, but we both worked at it piece by fragile piece. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were both fighting for the same thing. Love. Therapy became a cornerstone of our lives. Even after the initial turbulence had passed, it gave us a space to be vulnerable, to express fears and frustrations without letting them fester. One session in particular stayed with me. Our therapist, Dr. Lane, leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped thoughtfully. "You've both come so far," she said, looking between us. "But there's something I want you to think about. Why did you fight to stay together? What is it about your bond that made it worth salvaging?" Jack and I exchanged a glance. It was a question we hadn't asked ourselves, not in those exact words. I thought back to the early days of our relationship, to the laughter, the warmth, the sense of safety I had always felt with him. Even after everything, there was still a deep foundation of love. "Because I still believe in us," I said finally. Even when it felt impossible, I couldn't let go of that hope. Jack nodded, his voice quiet but firm. "And because I realized I didn't want to imagine my life without her. No matter what happened, I knew I wanted to fight for us." It was a turning point. A moment where the focus shifted from what we had lost to what we could still build. That realization didn't erase the past, but it made the future feel possible. About a year and a half after Tuscany, just as the dust of our reconciliation seemed to be settling, life threw us another curveball. Jack came home one evening, his face pale, a tension in his jaw I hadn't seen in months. "What's wrong?" I asked, setting down the glass of wine I'd been sipping. He hesitated, then handed me his phone. On the screen was an email. No subject line, just a sender's name that made my heart stop. Luca. I scanned the message, my breath catching in my throat. It was brief, written in his usual charming tone, but the meaning was clear. "Jack, it's been a while, but I've been thinking about everything that happened. I'll be in town next week and would like to meet. There are things we need to discuss. Let me know if you're open to it. Elle." My hand shook as I handed the phone back to Jack. "What? What does he want?" "I don't know," Jack said, his voice tight. "But I'm going to find out." There was no room for argument. Jack was determined, and I knew better than to try to stop him. Part of me didn't want to know what Luca had to say, didn't want to dredge up the past. But another part of me was desperate for closure, for some final resolution to the chaos he had brought into our lives. The meeting was set for a Thursday evening at a quiet restaurant downtown. Jack insisted on going alone, but as the evening approached, my anxiety grew unbearable. What could Luca possibly want after all this time? Did he regret what happened? Did he have some ulterior motive? The possibilities gnawed at me. When Jack finally came home that night, his expression was unreadable. He hung up his coat, poured himself a drink, and sat down across from me at the dining table. "Well?" I asked, my voice trembling. What did he say? Jack took a long sip of his drink before answering. He apologized, he said simply. He said he never should have agreed to be part of the setup, that he didn't realize how deeply it would affect either of us. I frowned, trying to process his words. That's it? He just apologized. Jack's gaze met mine, and I saw something darker there, something unresolved. Not exactly. He also said he still thinks about you. The air was sucked from the room. What? He said he regrets how things ended between you two, that he still feels something for you. The world tilted on its axis. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. Jack, don't, he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. I told him where we stand, that we've been working to rebuild, that you chose me, but I thought you should know. I nodded numbly, unsure of what to say. The revelation felt like a wound reopening, but this time, there was no space for fantasy or escape. Whatever feelings Luca had, they belonged to the past, a past I had no intention of revisiting. Thank you for telling me, I said finally. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Jack's expression softened, and he reached across the table to take my hand. We've been through worse, he said quietly. We can handle this too. And he was right. As unsettling as the encounter was, it didn't shake the foundation we had painstakingly rebuilt. If anything, it served as a reminder of how far we'd come. In the months that followed, life began to take on a sense of normalcy I hadn't thought possible. Jack and I started planning for the future: weekend trips, home renovations, even the possibility of starting a family. For the first time in years, our relationship felt steady, like a ship that had weathered the storm and found calm waters. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching an old movie, Jack turned to me with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about Luca? He asked, his tone curious rather than accusatory. I considered his question carefully. Sometimes, I admitted, but not in the way you might think. He was a wake-up call, a reminder of everything we'd lost. But he's not what I want. You are. Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I just needed to hear it. I leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his arm around me, and for the first time in a long time I felt at peace. The scars of our past would always be there, but they no longer defined us. We had fought for each other, and in doing so we had found something stronger than what we had before. Love, after all, isn't about perfection. It's about resilience. And together we had proven that we were stronger than the mistakes we had made. About 5 years after that pivotal trip, Jack came home one evening with an unexpected announcement. I've been offered a position in Europe, he said as we sat down to dinner. His tone was casual, but his eyes betrayed a hint of excitement and apprehension. Europe? I asked, setting down my fork. Where? It's a global division role based in Milan, he explained. They've been talking about it for months, but it just became official. It would mean a big step up for my career. Milan. The name hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken associations. Luca was the first thought that crossed my mind, though I quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't about him. This was about Jack and us. What would that mean for us? I asked cautiously. It's a 3-year contract, Jack said. We'd move there together if you're willing, but I won't take it unless you're on board. The thought of uprooting our lives and starting over in a foreign country was daunting, but there was a spark in Jack's eyes I hadn't seen in years. He wanted this, and deep down I realized I wanted it too. Maybe a fresh start in a new place was exactly what we needed. Let's do it, I said, surprising even myself. Jack's face lit up with a smile that made my heart swell. You mean it? I mean it, I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. Let's make this an adventure. The move to Milan was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The city was vibrant, with its cobblestone streets, bustling piazzas, and historic architecture. I threw myself into exploring our new home, taking Italian language classes and immersing myself in the culture. Jack's new job kept him busy, but he made a conscious effort to carve out time for us, a promise he had kept since Tuscany. For the first year, everything felt like a honeymoon phase. We hosted dinner parties for Jack's colleagues, strolled through the city hand in hand, and even started taking weekend trips to other parts of Italy. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly living. But life as always had a way of testing us. It happened on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished a yoga class and decided to stop by a cafe for an espresso. As I sipped my drink and scrolled through emails, a familiar voice jolted me out of my thoughts. Caroline. I froze, the cup halfway to my lips. Slowly I turned and there he was. Luca. He looked almost exactly as I remembered. Slightly older perhaps, but still effortlessly charming. His dark curls were shorter, and there was a hint of gray at his temples, but his smile was the same. Luca, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He sat down across from me without asking, his eyes scanning my face as if trying to read my thoughts. I can't believe it's you. What are you doing in Milan? My husband's job brought us here, I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. His smile faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly. Jack's here too. Yes, I said. We've been here about a year now. Luca nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. I've thought about you, you know. A lot. I felt a pang in my chest but pushed it aside. That was a long time ago, Luca. Maybe, he said, leaning back in his chair. But some things are hard to forget. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. The silence between us was heavy, charged with memories I had long since buried. Are you happy? He asked finally, his voice soft. Yes, I said without hesitation. We worked hard to get here. Luca studied me for a moment, then nodded. I'm glad. You deserve that. The conversation ended there, and I left the cafe feeling a strange mix of closure and unease. Seeing Luca again was like reopening an old wound, but it also reaffirmed how far I had come, and how much I valued the life Jack and I had rebuilt. I debated whether to tell Jack about the encounter. Part of me wanted to keep it to myself, but honesty had become the cornerstone of our relationship. So that evening as we sat down to dinner, I told him everything. Jack listened silently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he set down his fork and looked at me. Thank you for telling me, he said. How did it feel seeing him again? Strange, I admitted, but also clarifying. It made me realize how much I value what we have now. Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. I'm glad you feel that way. Because I do too. For the first time in years I felt a sense of true peace. Luca's reappearance hadn't shaken the foundation Jack and I had built. It had only strengthened it. The rest of our time in Milan was a whirlwind of new experiences and deepening connection. We learned to embrace the chaos of life, to celebrate the little victories and weather the challenges together. By the time Jack's contract ended, we both knew we had come out stronger. Not in spite of our past, but because of it. When we returned to the States, we brought with us more than just souvenirs and memories. We brought a renewed sense of commitment, a shared understanding of what it meant to truly fight for love. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was ours. And that was enough. In the end, love is not about avoiding mistakes or pretending they don't exist. It's about choosing each other again and again, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. And as Jack and I stood on the threshold of our next chapter, I knew without a doubt that we would keep choosing each other for as long as we could. Life moved forward as it always does, carrying us with it. Returning to the States felt like a second new beginning. After 3 years in Milan, where we had rediscovered each other in ways we never thought possible, coming back felt like closing the loop on everything we had endured and rebuilt. Our old house, which had once felt like a battleground of silent resentment, now felt like a blank canvas. We made it our mission to fill it with new memories. Jack and I settled into a quieter rhythm, one far removed from the chaos of the past. He accepted a position at a company that didn't demand the relentless hours he once endured. And for the first time in years, we had dinner together almost every night. Sometimes it was extravagant, cooked together with wine flowing and music playing. Other times it was just pizza on the couch while we watched a movie. The simplicity of those moments was what I had missed most, and now I cherished them in a way I never had before. But life wasn't content to let us drift into complacency. About a year after we returned, I found myself staring at a pregnancy test in the bathroom, my heart pounding. The 2 little lines stared back at me, unmistakable. I had dreamed of this moment at different points in my life, but the reality of it now filled me with equal parts joy and terror. Jack came home that evening, his tie already loosened, looking tired but happy. I met him in the kitchen, my hands shaking as I held out the test. He looked at it, then at me, his eyes widening in disbelief. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice a mix of awe and uncertainty. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I think we're having a baby." For a moment he just stared at me, as if trying to process the enormity of what I had just said. Then, to my surprise, he broke into a grin and pulled me into his arms. "We're going to be parents," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The months that followed were a blur of doctor's appointments, baby books, and late-night talks about how our lives were about to change. Jack was endlessly supportive, attending every appointment he could and even assembling the crib himself, a task that took 3 hours and more than a few choice words. It was a far cry from the man who once missed anniversaries and important conversations. He was present now, fully and completely, and I loved him all the more for it. When our daughter Grace was born, I thought my heart might burst from the sheer magnitude of what I felt. Holding her for the first time, her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, I realized that all the pain and mistakes of the past had led us to this moment. Jack, standing beside me, looked at Grace with a tenderness I had never seen before, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice trembling. We settled into parenthood with all the clumsiness and joy of two people figuring it out as they went along. Sleepless nights and diaper changes became our new normal. But somehow, even in the exhaustion, there was a quiet contentment that anchored us. Grace became the light of our lives, her laughter filling the house and making every sacrifice feel worth it. Still, there were moments when the past would creep back in. Sometimes I would catch Jack looking at me with an intensity that made me wonder what he was thinking. Other times, a casual mention of Italy or a glimpse of a photo from that time would send a ripple through me. But instead of letting those moments fester, we talked about them. That was the biggest change. We had learned how to be honest, even when it was uncomfortable. One evening after Grace had gone to bed, Jack and I sat on the porch, a bottle of wine between us. The summer air was warm, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. Jack swirled his glass thoughtfully, then turned to me. "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing it all?" he asked. I nodded, my chest tightening at the memory. "All the time. But maybe that's why we're stronger now. Because we didn't let it destroy us." He smiled, a soft, genuine smile that still had the power to make my heart flutter. "I'm glad we didn't give up. I'm glad we fought for this." I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers with his. "Me too." As the years passed, our lives grew fuller. Grace became a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, filling our days with laughter and chaos. Jack and I found new ways to nurture our relationship, whether it was a spontaneous weekend getaway, or simply sitting together in the quiet moments after Grace had gone to bed. The foundation we had rebuilt proved strong, even as life continued to throw its challenges our way. There were times when the shadows of the past still loomed, when insecurities or doubts would surface unbidden. But we had learned how to face them together, to confront the darkness without letting it consume us. Our love wasn't perfect, but it was resilient, forged in the fire of everything we had endured and emerged stronger for it. Looking back, I sometimes marveled at how far we had come. The woman I was in Tuscany felt like a stranger, a version of myself I hardly recognized. But I didn't resent her anymore. She had been lost, yes, but she had also been searching, for love, for connection, for something to fill the emptiness inside her. And in the end, that search had brought her back to where she was meant to be. As I watched Jack playing with Grace in the backyard one sunny afternoon, their laughter carrying on the breeze, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Life hadn't gone the way I had planned, but it had brought me exactly where I needed to be. And for that I was thankful. Years continued to pass, layering our lives with moments of joy, challenges, and quiet triumphs. Grace grew from a toddler into a curious, bright-eyed child, who seemed to have inherited the best parts of both of us. Her laugh could light up a room, and her boundless curiosity pushed Jack and me to see the world through fresh eyes. Every day with her felt like a gift, a tangible reminder of the love that had weathered every storm. Jack, now more present than I ever could have imagined, became the kind of father I had always hoped he would be. He attended every school play, every soccer game, and somehow found ways to make even the smallest moments special. Watching him kneel in the dirt to help Grace plant flowers in our garden, or hearing him read her bedtime stories in a dramatic voice that sent her into fits of giggles, made my heart swell with the kind of love I hadn't known was possible. As for me, I felt like I was finally coming into my own. The woman who had once felt invisible, buried under the weight of unmet